Well, I want to thank everybody for coming. So I see some familiar faces, so I'm thanking you twice because I am doubly thankful for your presence here. In this session, we're going to be speaking with the lovely Marjorie about the upcoming second volume of her hit image comic series, Monstress. It hits shelves July 11th, so that's the official release date. However, I think all of you should have gotten your Raffle tickets. We'll be calling out winners at the end of the session, and 5 of you will get not only the first but the second trade. So that's an incentive.
It's here and it's fresh off the press.
Just for you guys. It is a special surprise. No one else has it. So Marjorie is an attorney and New York Times bestselling author of over 19 novels. Her comic book work includes X-23, Black Widow, Dark Wolverine, and Astonishing X-Men, for which she was nominated for a GLAAD Media Award for outstanding media images of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community. She's also the co-creator of the Eisner-nominated series Monstress, which we publish. Yay!
Yay, best publisher ever!
She also currently teaches a course on comic book writing at MIT, so if any of you guys are interested in going back to school. We'll be talking with her for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to follow up with 5 minutes of audience questions, and then we'll line up for signings and give away the raffle winnings. So without further ado, we should probably start.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, in addition to your work in comics, as I mentioned, you do have almost 20 published novels to your name. Do you find that any of the skills that you developed writing fiction has bled over into your comic book work?
Absolutely. I don't think I could have written Monstress if I hadn't written all those novels. Partially because the demands of Monstress, from world building to character building, are so immense. There's so many different moving parts and so much that I'm trying to put to the book that if I didn't have a lot of previous skill and prose as far as just building worlds, building character, it would have been very, very difficult. My prior comic book work, again, was with Marvel, and I thought I knew how to write comics. I really did. I thought I knew how to write comics because I'd written the X-Men, I'd written all these other titles, and I thought I knew what to do. But I was playing in someone else's sandbox. I was writing pre-existing characters in a pre-existing world that's like ours. And what I realized soon after I started writing Monsters was I didn't know anything. Like, I had to teach myself how to write comics again from the ground up. Not as far as script writing goes, but just from the basics of narrative. Like, there are 3 basic narrative pleasures. You got character, conflict, and world. And when you're in the Marvel Universe, those are pretty much built in certain ways. With Monstress, I had to start from the ground up, and it was hard. It was really, really hard.
Well, is there anything that you felt didn't carry over from the world of fiction writing that you thought might work that just didn't slot at all?
You mean prose?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because when I write novels, for better or for worse, I'm a pantser. I write from the seat of my pants, right? Like, I just sit down and I'm just like, I just vomit it out, whatever comes to mind. And usually it's terrible, that first draft is terrible, but I go back and revise it. But the problem with comics is you can't really do that, because at a certain point you have to hand the script over to your artist, and your artist draws it, and once it's drawn, it's drawn. Like, you can't go back and revise something, even if you think it's really terrible. You have to live with it. And so the one thing that carried over with Monstress that was terrible was this desire just to pants things. And so for the first volume of Monstress, before it was even published, before I sent it to Sana, I spent almost 7 months trying to pants this thing, like volume 1, and it was not cute. Let me tell you, draft after draft was really, really not cute. And I had to stop and really reassess the way I do things and train myself with new skills as far as like plotting. For me, I was like, oh shit, no, it's terrible. But I had to this. And now I'm getting better at it. It's a multi-step process. I have to, talk to myself constantly. But that was difficult. That was a bad, in certain ways it's not a bad habit if you're writing a novel, but for comics that was a bad habit that I had to break myself up, and I'm still breaking myself up.
It does seem like a really steep learning curve.
Oh, it is.
Yeah. Well, at this point, especially, you seem to take your world building very seriously. How much time would you say you dedicate to things like language crafting, mapping out cartography? And does Sana assist you with that process, or do you have the idea firm in your head?
So it depends on the situation. So for example, maps, language, I think about those things, but I think a lot about culture, I think a lot about religion, I think about it's a lot of what-if questions, right? So what if this is a world in which there's a religious order of witch nuns whose religion is science, right? And what if there are these, human-animal hybrids whose bones produce this substance that can make these witch nuns, it can give them like extra powers, right? So like a lot of, just these what-if questions. Okay, so what if that is the case? I can commodify these bodies, right, to get this special substance. And I think about that. So I have a notebook where I just basically list out, all these different possible outcomes to these world-building questions that I ask, and then try to figure out which ones are the most interesting, but also the ones that create the most character conflict, right? Because you think about characters having like internal conflict, but then there's the external conflict in the plot, and which are the ones that are going to like intersect and cause sort of the most explosions in your story.
Do you have any particular inspirations when it comes to universe building or the minutia of stitching that together? Is there anybody that you think you look to even subconsciously?
It's interesting. When I was growing up, I was obsessed with books like Lord of the Rings and like Narnia. I was obsessed with like Little House on the Prairie, like all these sort of books of my childhood in which I was fully immersed in the worlds, and not just because the worlds were amazing, and they were, but because the characters were amazing, and the characters were so firmly a product of these worlds that living their lives through the text, like just sort of brought me into these worlds in ways that I just didn't want to leave. I want to be part of them. And so what I try to do when I write is I think about that. Like I think about building characters that are really deeply immersed in these worlds and are very much of these worlds. And I try to build wonderful worlds too, but I focus on characters first in the hope that if you become attached to these characters and fully involved in their lives, that you, by virtue of loving these characters, will just feel like you're being drawn, into their world, into their universe, the same way I feel like I was when I was a kid.
I think that's so important to create a meaningful experience, to be able to lose yourself in the story. So even, or possibly even especially in fantasy, the worlds that we create are a reflection of our real experiences. How much is the plot of Monstress evolving as a response to current events?
Current events, okay. So, let me describe Monstress just a little bit, in case none of you or some of you don't know what the book's about. So, Monstress is a book that's about colonialism. It's a book that's about slavery. It's a book about war trauma and what happens when you survive a war and how you put yourself back together. And it's also a book in which 98%, that's a rough estimate, of the cast is entirely female. Like it's all women. I think in volume 1 there may be only 3 male characters that have a speaking role. And some of them don't say much at all, like in those moments. And now, I started Monstress before this last election, and I had all these thoughts in my mind because these are issues that didn't just begin, in November, right? These are all issues that we've been wrestling with for a very, very long time. Basically, patriarchy, white supremacy, these were very present, right, in our popular media, but also in our daily lives. And I think that we become, it's easy to become, as I said like not long ago at another convention, it's easy to become emotionally invested in political fantasies that kill, right? So white supremacy is a political fantasy that kills. Misogyny is a political fantasy that kills. And people become very invested in these things, don't even realize that they are, right? How many times like do you hear like a dude say, well, you know, that's like they don't believe in rape culture, right? Well, that's a fantasy that actually murders women and ruins lives. And so I wanted to tell a book, I wanted to write a story and you know, and write a book that subverted these things and addressed these issues through the estrangement of fantasy. Because it's one, you know, I could have written a reality-based book that tackled these issues, but sort of the incredible thing about fantasy, about science fiction, is that it creates a level of estrangement. So I have, you know, I can write a book about slavery, about colonialism, about misogyny, about, you know, one that addresses white supremacy, you know, by the absence of whiteness. And yet, because it is a fantasy, you know, if you get the message, you do. If you don't, that's fine. But it's there. It's there whether or not you want to see it. And that's the great thing about writing fantasy and science fiction, because it's this tool that allows us to tell really difficult stories, but in ways that are sometimes easier for people to take in and learn from.
I think that's perfect. I actually wanted to ask also, and you've answered this before in terms of place, but in terms of your time frame, MONSTRESS is set in sort of an alternate history, 1900s in Asia.
Right.
And I was just wondering if that particular time period was always pretty firm in your mind as when you wanted to set it, and what it is about the 1900s that sort of connected with you.
Well, the important thing about the 1900s for me, there's several things. First of all, it was World War I, right? Which was one of the first modern era, like, cataclysmic wars. Like that was a cataclysmic war set in quote unquote the modern era. Now, the other thing about that time frame is that around the same time, Asia, specifically Shanghai, China, was like the Paris of the East. And not a lot of people realize that, but Shanghai had become this cosmopolitan city where people would flock to. It was this place of, quote, you know, mystery and tremendous wealth. I say mystery. Sort of like, you know, the Eurocentric idea of what mystery would be, you know, in Asia, which is a very different thing, you know, from really the reality. But still, but it was a place where people were going, and it was sort of the new frontier, right? Where if you wanted to shed your identity, if you were like a white dude, you wanted to shed your identity, you went to China and you like started over again, and that still happens actually. But the Shanghai of the 1900s was a very different place than it is now. And I wondered, and that was something I thought about a lot, and I thought a lot about the Asia that I grew up with, because I spent a lot of time living in China and Taiwan, and the Asia that I know is a hybridic Asia. And not just because I'm mixed race, but also when you are in China, it is a country of many cultures and many different languages, and yes, you have the monolith of the communist government, but beneath that monolith, it is a place of tremendous diversity. And that was something that I also thought a lot about, and I wanted to bring into the book. I wanted to tell a fantasy novel, write a fantasy novel in this medium that was not Eurocentric, right? I wanted to set it in Asia and really dig in about what that would look like, but also do something that would subvert so many of the Orientalist tropes that we are fed in our popular media, but also in some of our more Eurocentric stories and fantasies.
That's really important. I'd like to take it now down from a more universal perspective to a personal perspective. I know that you have mentioned in previous interviews at the start of the series that the character Micah doesn't really know herself or didn't really know herself. I'm just interested to know if you feel that has changed If you feel that has evolved or is evolving to embrace certain aspects of the figurative and literal monster that's living inside of her, and how that changes the story as it goes.
Absolutely. So the thing with Micah that's important to remember. How many of you have read the book? Right? Okay. So Micah is not what I would call a likable character, right? She survived this war. She was a slave. She's lost, her limb. She's angry. She's really, really angry, and she's angry at the world. And deep down, she's also angry at herself. She has survivor's guilt, and she's also, really conflicted about some of the things that she had to do to survive. Right? This is not easy stuff for her. So there's another character in the book named Kippa. Right? So for those of you who aren't familiar with Kippa, she's a little fox girl, right? She's very, she is cute. She has little fox ears and she has a little fox tail. The thing about Kippa is, Kippa is this sort of little bright light, right? She's got, a ton of just goodwill and compassion. She hasn't been broken yet. And I envision Micah was Kippa, right? That's how I see Micah. She was Kippa before this cataclysmic war. She was bright, she was young, and she was innocent, and she still had compassion, and she still had joy. And right now, Micah's in a place where she doesn't feel human. She feels like she's lost her humanity. And Monstress is about how you regain your humanity after you've been through something really, really terrible. How do you put yourself back together again after you've survived something absolutely horrific? And so when we first see Micah, she's just like, she's not great, right? And in volume 2, she's still in a bad place, but she's trying to learn more about herself. She's trying to learn more about her mother. And she's not softening exactly, but she's trying to learn. And what we're going to see, as the series continues is, when you first start out and you're like traumatized, like you're blocked, right? Like you're just kind of like, ugh. But then, the hope is that as one begins to evolve, you enter this state where you begin to contemplate healing. You don't just throw yourself into healing and say, I'm healed. Like you're first in a state of denial, then you're in like pre-contemplation, and then you're in contemplation, and then suddenly, I'm doing the work I need to become the person I want to be. And so this is like Micah's journey. Like she starts out in denial, like maybe now she's sort of in pre-contemplation. We're going to see her enter contemplation mode. But it's like a long process. It's not going to happen overnight, but it is happening. And the important thing to remember is that she's literally not alone in this. She has an actual literal monster living inside of her body that is also going through its own stages of healing and recovery. And their journey runs parallel to each other and is also intertwined in what I hope are some interesting ways.
Are there any other characters besides Micah that you feel have, especially as of the release of the second volume, become significantly different than how you saw them when you first, sketched their outline?
Yeah, like the monster itself, I think, has begun to evolve in my mind in ways I didn't expect. I had its story sort of planned out, and as I started writing volume 2, that story began to evolve, and the character began to evolve in some really interesting ways for me. But then, here's the thing about working with an artist as talented as Sana, is that she will create characters. I'll write the script, and I'll be like, okay, I want this, right? And she'll come back with a character design that is so full of life and so vibrant that I'm like, oh, yeah. So for those of you who have read volume 2, there's a character that shows up early on, and it's a shark pirate, right? Her name is Old Tooth, and she's literally a shark arcanic. She's like a humanoid shark woman, right? And I love her character so much, and I keep trying to think of ways I can bring Old Tooth into volume 3. Like, even if it doesn't make sense for her to be there, I just really want her to be there because I love the character so much.
Yeah, there'll be a desert scene and she'll just show up.
Exactly, and I want to learn more about her, just because I think she's so awesome. So things like that happen all the time.
Yeah. On a light note, I wanted to know which one of you came up with Professor Tamtam, and to that end, when we can expect a high-end stuffed animal to come.
All right. So I came up with Professor Tamtam. I mean, Sana, like, I was like, I want a Professor Cat with multiple tails, and I want her to have glasses. That's what I said to Sana, and Sana like came back with the actual design. So it was a collaborative effort in that regard. But the thing with Tamtam, and so for a little background for those who don't know the book, at the end of each issue, there is a lecture from Professor Tamtam. And the reason why I do that, and it's basically Professor Tamtam is like a three-tailed Siamese cat who has a little bandana and spectacles. She occasionally, smokes her like lady cigarette. For those who read the book, how many of you thought that Tamtam was a man or like male? Interesting, really interesting. So anyway, Tamtam's female, and so she gives like little lectures, these little kittens that sort of hang around. And the reason why I did that is there's so much world for Monstress. Like there's so much world in my head that I literally have no room for like in the story that I just had to share it. And at first it started out sort of like a joke on my part, being like, oh. And now for me it's become a really intrinsic and important part of the book, because what I realized as I was writing it was it's also sort of a commentary on time and space, like within Monstress, because you know how like, okay, we're here enjoying books and being librarians and being creators. Well, 7,000 miles away, someone could be going on the magical, supernatural quest of their lives, and we're completely unaffected and don't know anything about it, right? And the same thing with Professor Tamtam. I had the Professor Tamtam lectures in there as a way of sort of commenting on the fact that there's this whole other adventure taking place. And here is Professor Tamtam giving in like a little history lesson to kittens. And it could be in the present, it could be in the future of the book, it could be in the past of the book. We don't really know. Just the fact, though, that this is a world that's large enough to encompass whole other worlds, right? That there could be this world where this, Professor Tamtam's doing her thing, and Mike is over here, the fate of the world, like hinging like on her shoulders. And so it's fun for me to play with things like that.
Yeah, I think it's a really nice addition. It's especially nice because of the comic book format that you have the rest of the story told.
Yeah.
You give the flip side of that, which is where you do have a picture, but it is mostly sort of text-centric.
Right.
I think that's an interesting one.
But as far as the plushie goes, so a friend of mine sews and actually made me a giant life-size Professor Tamtam plushie, which is, I love it, but occasionally I look up and it's a little creepy, because my eyes are like piercing. I mean, I think that'd be great when they do a line of the cats.
Yeah.
From Monstress, and hopefully we'll have some more merchandise soon, like more like cat-centric merchandise. Yeah.
I think the world is ready for more cat stuff. On a personal level.
Yeah.
So you have been recognized by GLAAD on several occasions now, and I was hoping that you might talk a little bit about your relationship to the LGBTQ community and how that sort of relates to your own writing or any feeling of writing initiatives that you might have.
I think, to backtrack a little bit, I think one of the most important books I ever read, and I've been thinking about this a lot because, today's Pride, and one of the most important books I ever read was like Magic's Prize. It was this by Mercedes Lackey. It was the Valdemar series. And I come from a fairly conservative family, and we just never talked much, about like LGBTQ, like anything, like just nothing. And so I read, this is back in the 80s, and I read like Magic's Prize or Magic's, look it up, it's there. And the hero is a fantasy novel, and the hero is a young gay man. And I was like, this is the most beautiful, this is beautiful. This is like the most beautiful thing I've ever read. Why didn't anyone ever tell me that this existed? Like, this is amazing. And I think, and it also, made me think about my own sexuality, and it made me, just made me think a lot, right? And I'm still thinking a lot. But I've always felt like that. So, for example, I did the gay wedding in Astonishing X-Men, right? And this was before it was actually, I guess, made legal, like recognized, like by the federal government.
Yeah.
And for some background, my parents got married in 1977, less than 10 years after the Supreme Court ruled that it was illegal to ban mixed-race marriages. So at another age, I would not have been born. My parents would never gotten married. And I felt like that this was a civil rights issue, right? That gays and lesbians could not get married was for me like just, it was just mind-blowing. It was just so wrong. So I think because this issue means so much, I'm sorry, I'm babbling a little bit, but
it's easy to do that though because it is so personal.
it's so personal. It's really, really personal. And so with Monstress, I feel like with Monstress, with the X-Men, with X-23, with all the books I've done, I have tried to make them queer. Or at least that is how they can be read. You know, sometimes they're explicitly so, sometimes they are subtly so. But because this is so much a part of people's lives that it shouldn't be something that folks have to like search for. It should just, you know, it's.
I think that's one of the things that people appreciate about your work as well is that sometimes you do call attention to it and sometimes it is just there. And that is a reflection of real life. Too many times when writers, or actually I'll say any media, tries to tackle a subject, it's just that, they're tackling it. And that's not how life is. A person just is. And people need to see more characters where it is okay to just be. And I think that comes through in your writing. That's really important.
I think the greatest lesson I've had to learn growing up is just how to take up space. Like, I think it's really easy not to take up space and to be told that, oh, you have to be a certain kind of thing, you have to do this, you shouldn't say this. And we get raised to believe, or at least we're trained to hold ourselves in and to wear a certain mask of either respectability, you know, whatever our idea of respectability is or who we should be, we're trained to wear that mask. And the hardest thing to do is just take off that mask and just be like, no, I'm gonna be me, I'm gonna take up space, and that's okay. Like, and to not feel like guilt about it, not feel afraid, but just to do it. And that can be really, really hard.
Yeah, I think Lewis Carroll once described Alice, and either Alice or who it was, he described her muchness, her sense of muchness, and I think that people of color, women, and other marginalized groups have a problem with that sense of muchness because we're so
trained because if you get too much,
you gotta get back.
Exactly.
Yeah. In addition to your work as a writer, you're also an educator, which we touched on in the introduction. I just wanted to know what prompted you to begin teaching about comic book writing, and I'd also like to know if your interactions with your students have ever influenced a writing decision that you've made in the series.
Not really, actually, as far as influence goes. We don't talk about my work, because that would be really weird. But I don't have kids, and I probably won't ever have kids, but I think I have like a lot of mother energy. And so I just wanted to work with young people, actually. That's the honest truth. I wanted to teach, I wanted to work with young people. And I feel like I learn a lot from my students, just from the questions they ask, and me having to answer those questions in a really coherent way. But no one taught me how to write comics. Like, I had to learn from literally Googling how you write comics, right? Like sample scripts, things like that. I had to teach myself. And it worked out okay, but it wouldn't have been such a bad thing either to have a teacher, actually someone who's in the business, just saying, hey, you know what, here are the things you need to look out for. And also here are the differences between writing prose and actually writing comics, because there are actual real structural differences in how you present character and build world. Because just different strategies are needed, right? It's a very different thing to write a 100-page comic versus a 100 or 200-page novel. It's very, very different. But the other thing too is that I just came back from a week-long workshop, VONA, Voices of Our Nation, which is a writer's workshop for people of color. And I spent the entire week with 9 young women who are writing science fiction, fantasy, and thrillers. And that to me, we talked about narrative, we talked about identity, we talked about how to combine identity and narrative and how to build world and character. And it was so important to me because they're so, the numbers are growing, but publishing is still very, very white. And it's very male dominated. And so to work with young women of color and actually talk story, but point them, to give some mentorship, but also say, hey, you can do this. Like, you can really, really do this. Trust me, you can do this. Is also really rewarding. And I think that I wish that I'd had more people when I was their age saying, hey, it's okay. Like, I know you got a lot of pressures at home, but you can do this too. Like, forgive yourself for wanting to be an artist, and not wanting to be a lawyer or a doctor. Like, it's okay. People will still, your family will still love you. They may not understand, but they will still love you, I think.
Hopefully, and if your family doesn't still love you, the wonderful thing about adulthood is you get to choose a family that loves you.
Yeah,
and then it is okay to do that too.
Yes.
And I think that brings me actually to my last question. It's a really good segue. You already had a question about concepts that you were reading and the things that you wanted to recommend, but I'd like to know specifically for librarians, especially for graphic novel librarians, because the landscape is still pretty small, and they might not know about some creators. If there are any women or people of color, or women of color, that you'd like to recommend specifically that they might not have heard of.
Hey, lists. Because people always ask me, I always forget, right? Okay, so Prey of Gods by Nikki Drayden is a great YA novel. What's that? It's YA, it could be YA, it's like science fiction. Awesome, awesome book. Zen Cho's Sorcerer to the Crown, I love that novel. Let's see here, Cindy Pon, I think she's actually here this weekend. She wrote Want, which is a new sci-fi novel set in Taipei. Amazing, amazing book. Melinda Lowe, I love Ash. Stacey Lee, Ellen O. Jillian Tamaki, I can't say it enough. I love her Super Mutant Magic Academy. That graphic novel is so...
It's so good.
It's so hilarious, it's so subversive, and so weird, and I love it. It's just amazing. Let's see here. Sherry Smith's Fly Girl, amazing book. Jacqueline Woodson, Brown Girl Dreaming, I'm sure many of you know about that book. And Ellen O, who has written a new Korean fantasy YA novel. Really enjoy that.
Fantastic. We will we'll have the list at the table next to her while she's signing in case you guys want to take a photograph of your cell phone.
With my scrawl. If you can read my handwriting, I love you.
You'll have some time to decipher it. So we're going to go ahead and call out the raffle winners. Ashley, my bag, please.